Diving into Deep Waters. I am your host, Erin Rowling, and I love doing this series. I love having you a part of this series. I hope that we're learning so much and just gleaning, that's going to be a word today, of God's Word and people that were real. I think that's what's so cool is it's just not people that are just stories. It's people that actually lived and had encounters with God and all of this stuff. They saw God move in such amazing ways, and we get to read it. We get to slow down in our time of understanding these stories and understand a little bit more about what God was doing. What might they have been feeling? I feel a cat on my leg. I just realized I forgot to put the cats away. But people, we're on a time crunch, so if we have a little cat, we have a little cat. I don't know. Usually when they do your leg, paw at your leg, it means I'm coming up. And since most of my kids are gone, our cats are relying on Paul and I for their needs. Yeah, we're poor substitutes for our children loving on their animals. All right, we're going to get right into Ruth. And I actually contemplated about doing Ruth because I have done a series on Ruth. And so I thought, well, I've already done it. Should I do it again? I kind of went back and forth. And I was like, no, because here's the thing. We've talked about this before. When we read the Bible, we learn new things. We glean new things. We have more of an understanding or things that maybe we haven't thought of before. And so I was like, you know what? New perspective. I love this series that I did before. We've actually talked about making it into a booklet. Kara's probably like, I thought you forgot about that. It's just life is so crazy. I don't know how people do it all sometimes. I just don't. I don't know how people are authors and parents and speakers. I just don't know how they do it all. It's hard to get it all done. But I want to do Ruth again because, and what's interesting is there are things that I didn't pay attention to before. And so I'm excited to share it. And maybe you didn't even listen to the Ruth one, which I would advise you to go back and listen to it because there's some we went in depth. There's a lot to this story. So we're going to set the scene. We're going to start off with that. We have Israel is now being ruled by judges. And basically, it's kind of like God's fed up with them again, so he sends all these judges to judge them, basically. And during that time, the land of Bethlehem is going through a famine, which we've kind of talked. We've had famine in every single story, in Tamar's story, in Rahab's story, and now in Ruth's story, we have had famine. And there's a man named Elimelech. I actually think I got his name right. Go Aaron. And he takes his wife, I was going to say his wives, he has one, and his two sons, and he moves from the land of Bethlehem in Judah. And it's because there's a famine. He's kind of fed up with the land. He's like, this is not going to benefit us. I'm over it. And so he takes his wife, Naomi, and he takes his sons, Malhon and Kilian, and he moves them to another land called Moab. And this is not like the best decision because Moab is not a godly nation. So he's basically taking his family, moving them from a godly nation to an ungodly nation. He dies. So he leaves his wife and his two sons there. And his sons, living in Moab, it's probably hard to find an Israelite woman. It's just probably difficult. And so they end up marrying two Moabites, and their names are Orpah. I want to say Oprah. Every single time I say her name. I think when I did the Ruth podcast, I probably did say it. But it's Orpah and Ruth. And so here Ruth enters the scene. You think about it, Ruth was young and her husband was dying. And, for a young woman, for any woman of any age to lose her husband, unless you didn't like him. I mean, that's kind of a devastating thing. I've seen the devastation of that. We've had women in our church lose their husbands, and just maybe even just for the comfort side of things. And sometimes, like some women, they've never taken care of a lot of things in their family. So once their husband passes away, now they're like have this load of things that are now on their plate that they have to take care of. And if you think about Ruth, I mean, she's young, she's not had children yet, which, remember, back in this day, as a woman, you were expected to have children. That was your life. That gave your life meaning. And so to not have children is, pretty devastating. And to lose your husband, not to have someone to grow old with is pretty devastating. And not just for Ruth, but also for Naomi, who's a big part of this story. She bears the loss of her husband. She bears the loss of two of her sons. That's a lot. That's a lot of loss. I think losing just your husband would have been enough. I've watched people lose children. That is unbearable. It literally breaks you in a way that nothing else breaks you in the same way from what I've seen. And so here she's left with two daughter-in-laws. That's all she has left. No sons. I mean, sons are the ones that take care of you. Your husband takes care of you. If your husband's not around, your sons take care of you. If your sons don't take care of you, your grandsons take care of you. She doesn't have any of those things anymore. But one thing I do want to kind of take a moment just to bring to our attention is Naomi was a woman of faith. Even though her husband had moved her and taken her to another land, she never subscribed to the Moabites' way of doing things. She was an Israelite through and through. She served the one true God. That was never far from her. She didn't waver from that. That was important to her. And so I can only imagine with her daughter-in-laws, she probably shared that way of life with them. I mean, I think if I had a daughter-in-law, I don't have one yet, but if she was living in my household, that's going to be a byproduct of being with me. You're going to get to know who Jesus is because that's a part of my life. I think it was the same thing with Naomi. That's not what they were accustomed to. That's not how they had grown up, but Naomi was a woman of faith. And so I'm sure that was a topic of conversation, if you will, in their family. And the thing that's really cool about when you look at Ruth, Tamar, and Rahab, they all have something in common. None of them were raised in the ways of God, but they all come to this place where they want to serve him. They want to know about him. And I'm sure that, Ruth's husband was sick for a long time. It says he was a sickly man. And you look at her family, so they're Moabites. Same thing when you look at Tamar, like she wasn't bearing a son. So her family was looking at her going, what's wrong with you? Like, what have you done to displease the gods? I'm sure Ruth kind of ran into the same thing because, I mean, I think if Ruth, Rahab, and Tamar, if they would all been in the same time period, they would have been friends because they all would have had a lot in common. But I mean, Ruth didn't have any children yet either. And they'd been married for a while and she didn't have any sons either. And so I'm sure she also battled with her family of like, well, why haven't you produced sons? I mean, that was kind of like your job, if you will. Once you get married, is now you need to have sons. It's so sad when you think about the pressure that must have been put and like the disappointment you must have felt every month that you weren't pregnant, and also the disappointment of bearing a daughter instead of a son. Like, I have 3 daughters. They are a tremendous joy to my life. I can't imagine being more thrilled about my son than my daughters. Like, oh, finally I have a son. That's not how I felt. I was thrilled with each child, no matter what gender they were, they're mine. And so to go through that, to think that you would disappoint a God or maybe like, and have to maybe take a look at yourself, the pressure that would have put on a young woman. We don't think about these things, but these are the things that when we read through these stories, we really need to take a pause and pay attention to them because they really are important parts of these stories. And it gives us more of an understanding of the sorrow or the grief or the tribulation that these women went through. I think we just read them, like I've said before, and I've been guilty of it, and just not understanding. And that's what I'm really excited about doing this series is we're having a little bit more understanding. So Ruth was raised with that they could see their gods, but Naomi's God was an unseen God, completely different than anything she'd been raised with. And um I don't know, like the book that I read, it kind of talks a little bit, and like some of it was just like probably pure speculation, but it kind of gave you a little bit of food for thought. Like when her husband was sick, were her parents offering her to come back home when he died? Like he was going to die. They kind of knew that. But was that a temptation to her? Was she like, oh, I'm going to be a widow, I could get remarried again, I could go home to my family, my father could find a new husband for me? I don't know. We're human, and if I'm thinking that, I'm assuming Ruth probably thought the same things and had the same kind of thought through it. But when we see how tightly knit Ruth is with Naomi, even if it was a thought, I don't think it's anything she gave anything more than a thought to. She didn't allow that seed to grow in her mind at all, because she had such an incredible bond of duty too. Just when she became Naomi's daughter-in-law, she became Naomi's daughter-in-law. And I think they shared a real love and an affection for each other. I think it's something we can learn from in our relationships. Maybe, like, I don't have a daughter-in-law yet, but I do have a son-in-law, and I treasure him. I I really want to have a relationship, a special relationship with him. Paul's mom, when I married Paul, she just was the best mother-in-law and really taught me how to be an in-law. And I think Naomi here, she knew how to be an in-law, and she took it seriously, and built something really, really special that really came to play. I don't think if there wasn't a relationship there, when we get to the part where it's just like Ruth has this saying, and it's so profound, her loyal heart to Naomi. I don't think that would have happened if Naomi had not built this bond, because obviously I don't think she really built it with Orpah. I think they had a different relationship. So think about that. If you have a son-in-law or daughter-in-law, like, what kind of relationship are you building with them? Just something to put out there. Now, Naomi, the grief she bore. I wrote this line and I actually thought it was good. And I wrote it down because I just thought there's so much grief in the world. In our line of work, we deal with a lot of grief and a lot of sorrow. And I just thought that this line was very fitting when you're talking about grief. It says, grief is deeper when the sun goes down and the memories rise up with the moon and the stars. I think that's true. I think when life is quiet and you're left with your feelings and you're left with your grief and the impact of your grief, I don't know. I think that's why the Bible verse says weeping may endure for the night. Like at the night, I don't know, it seems to affect us more. Not saying it doesn't affect us during the day, but it says, but joy comes in the morning. There's just something about that. I think that after losing her husband and her sons, her faith was tested. I'm sure she offered a tremendous amount of prayers on behalf of her husband and her sons. I read this line. It said that the locusts were feasting upon her faith. I'm sure that's exactly how she felt. I don't think she ever wanted to go to Moab. I don't think that that's what she wanted to do. I think she wanted to stay in Bethlehem. I think she trusted God, or her husband didn't trust God, but I think she did. I think her husband went through this process of feeling abandoned by God, and so he argued with the fact of, like, if God's abandoned us, why would we stay here? Let's go somewhere where we can if God's not going to take care of us, I'll take care of us. And, they mortgaged their land. They left. They packed up their belongings. I'm sure at that moment even Naomi began to feel like her family started to fall apart because moving to a foreign land was so different than staying in a land that had your same beliefs and practiced the same things that you had, and then going and being indoctrinated by another land was going to change the trajectory of her life, which it truly did for some of it. I think with moving, her sons forgot who God was. That wasn't a priority to them. His commandments weren't something that they were paying attention to anymore. And she probably just found herself in this place in the span of 15 years of losing her husband and her sons, like she was drowning in a sea of sorrow. I think that's where she found herself. That's the real rawness of Naomi's situation. There's a verse that said, men decide their own path, but it is God who judges and God who prevails. Her husband decided on a path, and at the end of it, it didn't turn out so good. But her story is not done, right? I'm sure she questioned, would things, like when you're in those kind of situations, you always think, what if I would have done something different? What if I would have chosen something different? Would my life be different? We all do that. That can be a dangerous game because here's the thing. You can't change the past. You can only change the future, but the past is the past. And there's, I think she finally came to a point where she was like, I can either stay here and just mourn for the rest of my life, or I'm going to have to do something about this, which is what she chose. She chose that she was going to change her circumstance. And even though she's like a bitter woman when she decides to change her circumstance, I think we can all take note of that. Like, you don't like how your life is going, or maybe your past experiences or past decisions are kind of catching up with you. Have you thought about changing your circumstances? It's just a thought. I'm just throwing it out there. I didn't even write that down. That's for free, you guys. So, she decides that she is going to return to Bethlehem. She's going to go back. That's where she longed for a home. She wanted to be home. And she knew that Ruth and Orpah would insist on coming with her. And so she didn't even she was just like, hey, I'm going to go. And they packed up their stuff and they're like, okay, let's go. She didn't even deter them at that point. But when she kind of came to where it was like, all right, it's too far to turn back, that's when she stopped them. And she was like, listen, you understand, the reality is probably hitting you that you're leaving. And I'm going to give you the option, and I'm going to tell you, not even give you the option. She's just like, hey, go home to your family. Like, just go. It's okay. Go. And of course, them being, love her, they have a relationship with her, and it's the right thing to do. Maybe they're like, no, of course not. We're not going to do that. We want to go with you. We want to be with your people. And Naomi remains firm. And she's like, listen, here's the truth. Here's the facts. The facts are, I have no more sons to give to you. And even if I could have sons, which I can't, if I were to get married tomorrow and I had more sons, by the time those sons are old enough to have children, you're going to be too old. So really, this is not going to work out for anybody. And so you're going to be doomed if you stay with me. You'll be a widow for the rest of your life. Your life is over. So go home. You have a chance of getting remarried and beginning your life all over again if you go home. And so Orpah was like, I'm out. I think it shows right here the difference in the relationship, which, by the way, if you don't have a great relationship with your son-in-law or daughter-in-law, pray on it. Pray for a great relationship. Pray for her. Pray for him. Pray that things will be different. I just want to say that. Because not everybody does. That's a fact. And so Orpah, she kisses her mother-in-law goodbye and she leaves. But Ruth, this is like the moment of Ruth. She says, "Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. I will go wherever you go, and I will live wherever you live. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. And I will die where you die and be buried there. And may the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us." I'm sure that after this beautiful speech that Ruth gives Naomi, Naomi still tries to say, like, "Hey, honey, you can go back. I have no problem with that." And maybe even reminded her, like, "Listen, my ways are so different than the way you've been raised. Like, if you come back to my land with me, that your life will not be easy. You're a Moabitess. We don't do well with foreigners. We don't really like them. And if you come back, you'll have to keep the Sabbath and the holy days. You can't be close to the Gentiles. You maybe can't do some of the stuff that you could do before. You have to keep all these commandments. There's like over 600 of them. You're forbidden to worship strange gods." She probably reminded her of all those things. But Ruth stands firm in her decision to her mother-in-law. And Naomi is like, okay. She saw that Ruth was solid in her decision and that there was no changing her mind. So she's like, all right, let's go then. We're going to travel back to Bethlehem. Now, we skip over this fact a little bit, and I can't remember exactly what I said in my Ruth podcast and what I didn't. So if I'm redundant, you probably forgot to. But I think we skip over this fact that we have two women traveling by themselves. An old woman who's frail, who's riddled with grief and sorrow, which, if you know anybody like that, it often has a lot of physical effects too. Like, you age prematurely, your body is not the way it should be, because when you allow those feelings to seep into your bones, it has an effect on you physically, not just mentally, but also physically. And so you're dealing with two women who have to travel, and not just travel like, in a car or on a donkey. They're walking. They don't have many possessions. They only have what they can carry on their backs. I'm sure they're going on roads where robbers are, where men can take advantage of them. I mean, Ruth was young and she was beautiful. A guy's going to notice those kinds of things and not have the best intentions to her, and not just travel road, but they've got to go over mountains. And this is difficult. And yet we just kind of like, oh, they get to Bethlehem. It's like, well, I'm sure there's a lot that happened between Moab and Bethlehem. I'm sure there were some stories of how God protected them and kept them safe, because obviously they made it without being robbed. I think if they were, it would have said it. But I also wanted to kind of take a moment and think, so they're traveling and they pass through the Jordan River. They pass by it. And I wonder if these are moments that Naomi shares with Ruth about her God. Like, that we had the Israelites, they were on the other side of the Jordan, and they came there and the river was swollen, and the Lord told them to have why I'm forgetting their name. The priests walk into the water with the Ark of the Covenant, and the water's divided. People walked across. Then they took these 12 stones and they built an altar here, because to show, so we can see it, that God was here, that God did something here. As they walked past Jericho and they saw the rubble, like, look at what God did. These walls were this big and they came tumbling down, and began to tell her all of these stories because the things were visibly in front of them. It's kind of like when you take someone on a ride and you've already been there. I'll use my dad. My dad, the first time I met him, he is a history buff. I'm not. But we stopped at all these landmarks and he was like, so, well, let's read this. And I was like, not interested in the least. But I think that if I was with Naomi and she was telling me, like, oh, my God did this and my God did that, and look you can see it, and I might have been a little bit more interested. But I think that those were also probably moments that would build Ruth's faith in God because she got to see firsthand, like, oh, God did this. Oh, God did that. That's amazing. How incredible that he did all of these things. Now, we know that Naomi is bitter. And I'm assuming she probably wasn't the easiest person to travel with. I've traveled with cranky kids before. Oh, so fun. So fun. But can you imagine someone who's bitter? They're just a Debbie Downer. They're no fun to be around, but they make it. And it says when Naomi gets there that the whole town was stirred up. I mean, it was a big deal. Everyone knew who Naomi was. And the women asked, is that really Naomi? I'm sure because she had changed a bit physically too, because she, you know, wasn't a happy camper. She was destitute. They would pity her. So this is her reply. So this tells us how bitter she is. She says, don't call me Naomi. Instead, call me Mara, which means bitter. For the Almighty has made life bitter for me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me home empty. Why should you call me Naomi when the Lord has caused me to suffer and the Almighty has sent such tragedy? Bitter much? She's bitter. And I have like, you feel like you have a sneeze and then that's how I feel right now. Anyways, also notice something here. They see Naomi, they pay attention to Naomi, everything's on Naomi. Ruth is there, but it doesn't make any mention of them saying anything about Ruth. Now, I think there's a reason for that, because she probably was wearing her clothes that showed she was a Moabitess. That means she's a foreigner. And women did not like foreign women because foreign women took their men. They defiled them because of the use of their gods. And so all that stuff, they were not very well received. And so I think it's interesting that we're seeing everyone paying attention to Naomi, but no one's paying attention to Ruth. And Ruth is right there with her. I think that the people realized that this Naomi was someone that they didn't know, because when she left, she was full of joy. And now that she's returned a wretched woman. And they can definitely see that in her. Another thing that I paid attention to this time that I don't think I did before was it doesn't say anyone offered them lodging or food, a place to stay. And maybe, again, some of that had to do with the fact that Naomi's daughter-in-law is a foreigner. And they are not going to bring that kind of woman into their house. I can't imagine the segregation that they felt, the loneliness that they felt. And what's interesting to me, and it just kind of popped into my head, but when you think of Jesus, it's Bethlehem, right? That's where Naomi and Ruth are, Bethlehem. There was no place for them. For Mary and Joseph. There was no room in the inn for them. No one takes Ruth and Naomi in either. Bethlehem is not a very giving city. It's not very hospitable, as you can tell. Not even when Jesus came. Now, we don't know where they stayed. It doesn't say where they stayed. We do know, though, that at that time, there would be a lot of caves. And so when people needed a place to stay, they could stay in the caves. It kind of was what people did when they needed lodging. And so whatever happened, they did find some lodging of some kind. But I'm sure wherever they found, whenever they rested their head that night, I'm sure Naomi thought, all these years I've dreamed of coming home. And this is not what I dreamed of. That's not what I expected to happen when I came home. And now I'm sure it didn't take long before they realized, like, how are we going to take care of ourselves? Here we are, 2 women. We have no men. How are we going to figure this out? And it was Ruth. I mean, Ruth steps up to the plate hugely. Now, there is something in Scripture that talks about when Ruth and Naomi come into Bethlehem. It says they arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, which meant it was time to reap it. So it's grown. It's time to cut it down. I'm sure Naomi told Ruth about the fields and how they would leave some grain. Actually, so the corners of the fields, the edges and the corners, they were commanded to not take the barley from those spots because those spots were left for the poor to gather. And so, which is interesting when things are done God's way, he's like, I'll take care of the poor. Make sure that there's food for them so no one goes hungry, which probably was different from Ruth because her gods that she grew up with, they only took stuff. But the Israelite God gives you stuff. Kind of interesting. And Ruth took advantage of this, the knowledge of this, that it was time to reap. It was going to be the only way they were going to survive. Otherwise, they would die. And Ruth just says, hey, I'm going to the fields. I'm going to go glean. I'm sure Ruth was worried or Naomi was worried for Ruth because, again, she's a foreigner. I mean, we can't really get around that. She could be taken advantage of. Lots of things could happen. People could throw sticks at her or stones at her and tell her to get away and just not be nice to her. But it says that she found herself in the field belonging to Boaz, and who was a relative of her father-in-law. Is that coincidence? I think not. And no one bothered her in Boaz's field. She was welcome to pick grains of barley in there. And so now we have Boaz who shows up on the scene. And I think Boaz realized he was definitely a very blessed man. He was definitely a devout Christian. He served God gladly. He was very thankful for his blessings. And so I don't know if he was standing at the end of his, they're reaping. It's the time to do that. And he's standing out at his field and he's like, look at all the things that God has given me. And then he sees this beautiful woman in his field and he's like, who's that girl over there? He inquires of her. And his hired man says, she is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. And she is asked to glean in our fields. And she came into the fields and has remained here from the morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz makes it his business to talk to her, to speak to her. And he tells her, like, stay in my field and don't go to any other field. Stay right behind the women who are gleaning here. Don't worry about the men. They've been told to leave you alone. And when you're thirsty, feel free to go get yourself a drink. And Ruth, out of thankfulness of her heart, she falls at her feet and she thanks him. And not only that, but she's a little bold and she says, why are you being so kind to me? And she's like, do you notice I'm a foreigner? And Boaz is like, yep, I know. But he says, but I also, see, he looks past the fact that she's a foreigner. But I also know of the love and kindness that you have shown your mother-in-law Naomi since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and your mother and land to live here among complete strangers. And then he gives her a blessing. He says, may the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully. And Ruth replies, I hope I continue to please you, sir. You have comforted me by speaking so kindly to me, and even though I am not worthy as your workers. Now, I don't know about you, but I read a little part and I'm like, were there some little sparky sparks here? Was there a little bit of like, I don't know. I mean, what did Boaz think of her? And here's the thing, why? And I did not talk about this in my other podcast. I'm like 99.9% sure I didn't. There's a 1% chance I did. But because we've been doing Tamar and Rahab and now Ruth, and we just did Rahab, right? Who is Boaz's mother? She was a foreigner. She was a Canaanite. But yet she was grafted into God's chosen people. So when he sees this young woman who has denounced her gods to come be with Naomi, she's a worker. She's willing to provide for her mother-in-law. I think he was kind of paid attention and was kind to her because his own mother, if you know, like when you've had gone through a situation and then you see someone else in that situation, you have more compassion for that person because you've already been there. And Boaz was not a full Israelite. His dad was an Israelite, but his mother was a Canaanite. Could that have something to do with why he wasn't married either? Did the Israelite women want to marry a man who was half and half? There could have been some prejudice stuff here that we're not aware of. I'm just saying, something I never thought of before. But is this also why he was so kind to her? Because he himself was not a full Israelite. He was half Canaanite, half Israelite, and here's a Moabite woman who is coming to live in the land of the Israelites. And I don't know, maybe he was stirred a little bit by her good looks, but it does talk about how he felt like he was old. And maybe any thought that he had went away because he was like, I'm too old because she's young. But anyways, he does call her at mealtime to have some bread. And when she comes, he offers her some roasted, I've never heard of roasted, but some roasted grain. And he offers her a double portion, which shows that he's not just taking care of her, but he's also taking care of Naomi to give her a double portion. And he gives her as much food as she wants, and she takes her leftovers and she wants to take them to her mother-in-law because Ruth is doing this for Naomi, obviously for herself too, but she's going to take care of her mother-in-law. And when she gets up to go, Boaz goes out of his way to tell his men to let her gather among the sheaves, to even go as far as to pull some out for her to pick. And here's something I never thought of before. She probably didn't have any tools to break the barley. Like one of those, what are they called? Sickle? Is it called a sickle? Some of you are answering me. Like to break the barley down. She's probably having to break it with her hands to get the barley. And so maybe Boaz saw her hands and was like, oh no, this isn't gonna do. And he had compassion on her, and he tells his men, hey, you just leave, you make sure you leave some sheaves for her so she can get them. And she gets so much that it amounts to an ephah, which is about 10 days of food. She gleans all of that. And she carries it back to Naomi, very proud of what she's accomplished for the day. And she gives Naomi the leftover lunch because she's going to take care of her. And Naomi, I'm pretty sure she was shocked. It says she was stunned. And she said, where did you glean today? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. And so Ruth told her where she went. She was like, I worked in Boaz's field. And then Naomi shared with her, this is what she says to her. She also probably shared with her, like, well, you know what? Boaz's mother is Rahab, and she was from the Canaanite. There's probably a little story time there. And maybe that's why he's being so kind to you. But Naomi was a wise woman. I don't know how many guys would just be like, yeah, just leave some extra grain. You know, like when you have a story, like when I remember Amanda when she was dating Frank, and he called her. She was home for Thanksgiving or something like that. She didn't know if he liked her. And we were in Target, Black Friday shopping or something like that. And he was texting her and showing her pictures of his dog and stuff like that. And she's like, but I don't know if he likes me. And I was like, the boy likes you. Why would he talk to you like this if he didn't like you? Maybe Naomi picked up like, I think the boy likes the girl. I think Boaz maybe has a little something for Ruth here. And this is what Ruth says. Naomi says, the Lord bless him. He has not stopped showing his kindness for the living and the dead. The man is a close relative. He is our guardian redeemer. And Ruth has more news because she says, well, Boaz invited me to stay in the field for the remainder of the harvest. So not only did he feed her, give her water, putting grain out for her, but he's like, just come here every day. Only come to this field. We will take care of you. and they were provided for. And I wonder if this is the moment where Naomi was like, maybe I have hope. Maybe there's hope for me. Maybe I'm not going to be this bitter old woman for the rest of my life. Maybe there's hope. And there's also a moment where Naomi realizes Ruth needs a man. I got to make sure she's taken care of. I think she wants to give back to her because of Ruth's dedication. And also, if Ruth marries someone, then they're both taken care of. It will be good for Naomi too. And so she didn't have to look very far because there is Boaz. And remember, he's a relative. And she tells Ruth this. So Boaz is going to be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. So I want you to wash. I want you to perfume. I want you to get dressed in your best clothes. Then I want you to go down to the threshing floor and don't let anyone know that you're there. When he's done eating and drinking, pay attention where he goes and lays down, and then go uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. I don't know if anyone's ever told you to do that, but I'd be like, heck no. I don't think so. But again, I think this shows the kind of relationship that they had that Ruth would trust, because it says Ruth was obedient and she went and did. She says, I will do whatever you say. I mean, that's amazing. It says it so simply, but I have to believe that Ruth was freaking out. Like, what if things go wrong? Like, what's going to happen if someone sees me? Like, there goes my reputation. There goes Boaz's reputation. But yet she trusts Naomi. So Boaz finishes eating and drinking. It says he was in good spirits. He went and laid down, and Ruth approaches him. She uncovers his feet, lays down. Her heart had to be racing a million miles a minute. I don't know if she fell asleep like that or whatever. And but then in the middle of the night, something wakes up Boaz. Maybe at first he thought it was a mouse because he is on the threshing floor. There's a lot of grain. But he looks and he sees a woman at his feet and he says, who are you? And she replies, Sir, your servant Ruth. And she says, spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are the guardian redeemer of our family. Now, some of you are like, what's a guardian redeemer? This was God's way of providing for a widow. And a family redeemer could take the widow as his wife. And if she bore a son, that son would not take her husband's name. They would take on their dead husband's name, so that their dead husband had an heir, so that his name could continue to live on. And so basically, then they would get a portion of land so that their lineage could continue, basically. And Boaz is not scared off by this. Actually, I wonder for him just as much as Naomi, if that was a sign of hope for Naomi. I wonder for Boaz if he was like, I have a chance. My life is not over, because he was older. So he was getting up there in years, and he wasn't married, and he didn't have any kids. And he says, the Lord bless you, my daughter. And he commands her for her kindness, for not running after younger men. It's just kind of funny to me. And I actually talk about that in depth in my other podcast. He tells her not to be afraid. He will do what she asks. He tells her she is known for being a woman of noble character. There's just one little itty bitty problem. There's another one who is also a family redeemer who can take her over Boaz. Like someone else is in line before Boaz. And but he says, hey, stay the night. We're not going to worry about it right now. And in the morning, we'll see if the other guy wants to marry you. And if not, I will marry you. I mean, I'm sure Ruth was like, okay, my fate, and I do get into this in my other podcast, my fate is not in my hands. Can you imagine? Like, I got to choose who I wanted to marry. I said yes because I wanted to say yes. I can't imagine having my fate rest in two guys figuring out if they who wants me? you know? So it says she gets up early in the morning. He fills her shawl with barley and he sends her on her way. And Ruth gets back to Naomi, and Naomi is probably like, what's going on? What happened? Fill me in. I need deets. Tell me all the details. And she's like, you know what? Boaz will do what's right. Now we just wait and see what happens. Okay. Let's just clean. Or I'd be like, la, 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 the whole time. And Boaz is a man on a mission. He does not let this slide. He leaves the threshing floor. Now, I know some farmers, and there isn't much that takes them away from their field when it is time to do your crops, either planting or harvesting. Those men are committed. They are out there. They don't do much else than that. That's their life, because that's money. That's how you provide for your family, right? Boaz is a farmer for all intents and purposes, but not today. He's got something to do, and he heads right to the city gates. Now, remember, we've talked about this in many podcasts about that's where business was taken care of, us at the city gates. He finds the other guy. He talks to him so smoothly. He's like, hey, can we just sit and have a little chat? Let's just talk. And the guy's like, okay. And so they're sitting there, and he has these other 10 guys sit there too, because you have to have witnesses. Everything has to be done with witnesses. And he's like, hey, buddy, there's a piece of land. It's Elimelech's land, which it was good land. It was land that this guy would want. And he's like, so, if you're the first person who can go ahead and get it, you're the first guardian redeemer. It's up to you if you would like to take it. And if you'd like it, but if you don't want it, then I'll take it. And so the guy's like, oh, absolutely. I want the lamb. And then Boaz is like, good. Okay. So with that comes Ruth. And you'll need to marry her because Elimelech's son died. And so they need someone to carry on the lineage, the legacy of their family. And so you'll need to marry her. And then her sons will also get a portion of your land. And then they will need to have their heritage. And then the guy's like, nope, I'm out. I mean, you see the wisdom with Boaz. Boaz is a wise man here. And so where am I at in this story? Because there's a part that I want to read you. So the guy says to Boaz, you buy it. And Boaz is like, absolutely. And he immediately tells the elders and the people there, he says, I want to buy the land and I want to take Ruth as my wife. And they say, we are your witnesses that you are going to buy the property. You will also acquire Ruth as your wife so you can redeem her husband and her family name. Now, here's the part that brings everything that we've been talking about. It brings it together, which is so cool. I love how this happens because it says, may the Lord give you descendants by this young woman who will be like those of our ancestors, Perez, the son of Tamar and Judah. It goes back to Tamar. They're like, may Ruth be like Tamar. See? Isn't that crazy? And so there's a wedding, a baby is conceived, Ruth gives birth to a son. And here's the really strange part of this story, because I don't think that we get this, but it shows the honor and the willingness of a woman to show honor to her mother-in-law and for a legacy to be born, which I don't know if we understand it on this level, because the women say to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. And Naomi took care of him, and the woman said, Naomi has a son. And they named him Obed, and he was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Do you not see the legacy here? Obed is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David. Oof. Naomi had been stripped bare. I mean, everything had been stripped from her, but it was built back on this firm foundation, and she was given, her name changed from Mara back to Naomi. But I think the part we don't pay attention to is the cost that it was to Ruth and Boaz, because it says Naomi raised him. That was her son. I'm sure Ruth had a part in it, but I don't think we really understand that thinking, because that's not something that happens in our day and age. But it's just something I kind of want to point out to you, because the sacrifice, Ruth sacrificed and sacrificed and sacrificed and sacrificed. And even when it was like her moment of joy, she still sacrificed to see Naomi happy and taken care of and loved. Wow. I mean, I don't know if there's anybody who's even come close to that kind of dedication anywhere in the Bible or anyone that I've known. And what's interesting is in the genealogy of Christ, and at the end of Ruth chapter 4, here's what's cool though. Even though Obed was born to continue Ruth's husband and Naomi's husband, to continue that line, it says Boaz was the father of Obed. It doesn't say Milian is the father of Obed. It says Boaz. So the Lord gives credit to Boaz, not to Naomi's son, which is kind of cool. I don't know. It was just something that I wanted to point out. And it's so cool that here God took Ruth, who was a Moabitess, and she was a woman of character. It didn't matter that she was an Israelite. That didn't matter where she came from. You can be more than where you came from. And I think that's something that I just want us all to grasp. It doesn't matter where we came from. We talked about that in the last few podcasts. It doesn't matter what the upbringing that we've had or the circumstances that we've had. God's bigger than that. He's so much bigger than that. That if we will be women and men of character, if we will pursue God, if we will lean into Him, He grafts us in. If we're willing to accept Him as our Savior, He grafts us in. It doesn't matter if we were raised in a Christian home or if we weren't raised in a Christian home. We matter. Our choice matters. And the Bible even says, a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her work praise her in the gates. Ruth feared the Lord in such a way that God honors her in His genealogy. I hope that you can take something away from her story. She's amazing, and I think we have a lot to learn. I would recommend you go back and listen to Ruth. I think we have 3 or 4 parts. I guess we should check on that. And I'm excited to get into Bathsheba with you next week, which I don't know a whole lot about that story. I do and I don't, and so we're going to learn together. So see you next week.